He was halfway through a buttery bite of toast when the muzzle of a pistol kissed the back of his neck, and the coffee cup slid from his hand, spinning once in the air like a coin before shattering into a spray that made everyone in the diner flinch, as if struck by the fragments themselves. And as the shouting began and the door banged open and boots thundered past the pie case, Daniel Cross understood with that cold, familiar clarity that the life he had built out of silence and breath and small, decent habits had just run out of time. Outside the windows, a blizzard of blue and red light bled across the steamed glass. Tires squealed, and a phalanx of officers flooded the entry like a tide that had finally learned his name, while inside, the room held a stunned, almost reverent hush, the kind that fills church aisles a second after a hymn ends. The waitress with the gray ponytail gripped the coffee pot with both hands as if it were a life preserver. The trucker in the corner froze with a forkful of scrambled eggs halfway to his mouth, and a toddler began to cry in a high, keening sound that cut through Daniel's sternum. The man with the pistol to his neck spoke in a level, practiced tone that made the hair stand on Daniel's arms, identifying himself as law enforcement, demanding Daniel's hands where they could see them, promising that if Daniel moved too quickly this would be over in a way that no one wanted. And Daniel, who knew how these moments metastasized into headlines and eulogies, set the toast down and lifted his palm steady and open, as if he were surrendering to a tide rather than men. The lead officer, a square-shouldered sergeant whose badge gleamed under the diner's yellow lights, was already reciting charges that made the air feel thin. Suspicion of armed robbery, suspicion of murder during commission of a felony, obstruction, evasion, and a list of words meant to flatten a life into codes and ink. And as he spoke, he searched Daniel's face for some reflexive twitch of guilt or fear, but what he found instead was an uncanny calm, like the calm before a cliff gives way beneath a cliff walker's feet. Daniel said there had to be a mistake. He had no idea what they were talking about, and the words did not come out pleading but precise, like the way a man might say his name to a doctor, just before anesthesia takes him under. A hush rippled through the booths, and someone whispered that they recognized him from last Thursday when he helped an old man to his car during the rain that came down like nails. And someone else whispered that he always tipped in cash, and someone else said they had seen him running the river path before dawn, lean and soundless. When the cuffs bit his wrists, a whisper slid from him so soft it might have been a prayer, barely a handful of syllables, but the closest officer heard it and flinched as if touched by a ghost, because the words came in a cadence that did not belong to a drifter, did not belong to a handyman or a man who liked the quiet corner booth, did not belong to anyone who should have known the call signs of a unit that had no public name, and for a heartbeat his grip loosened before training snapped it tight again. The sergeant ordered the room cleared and the phones put away, but the phones were already up, lenses hungry, and the world outside had already begun to swallow the scene through a dozen shaky frames. They pushed Daniel through the doorway into a wind knifed with grit, where patrol cars idled in a row like armored cattle, and the sirens that had been restrained inside the diner's warm walls now tore at the sky without apology. Daniel blinked against the sweep of light and counted instinctively. The windows across the street, the angles of egress, the way his right hand could still move a fraction despite the steel, the rhythm of breath in the sergeant's throat, the distance to the cruiser door, because even a man who has decided he will not run must sometimes make sure he still knows how. A woman he recognized from the early morning bus stop called out that they had the wrong person, her voice brave and shaking, and something in Daniel's chest bent without breaking because kindness, in his experience, was always the first casualty of confusion. The questions began before the cruiser door opened. Hard and efficient about where he had been yesterday at noon when the bank camera caught a figure in a navy cap, about why he carried no wallet or ID, about the thin, pale scars crossing his palms like the map of a river delta, about why he rented in cash from a landlord who could not remember his last name. And Daniel answered with quiet patience that noon found him at the community shelter hauling crates, because the truck arrived early in the heat, and the driver needed hands, that he carried no phone because he liked to walk without the hum of a pocket telling him who he was, that the scars were from a younger life and not from any theft, that the landlord never asked more than the bills were worth, because sometimes men who have lost things are generous in the small ways they can manage. The sergeant's mouth tightened as if he were biting down on a doubt he could not swallow, and when he guided Daniel's head beneath the cruiser frame, Daniel felt a familiar vertigo as if he were stepping into a metal memory that promised nothing but hours of fluorescent light, and questions shaped like traps. Across the lot, a skinny rookie with a nervous jaw watched Daniel with the haunted fascination of a man seeing his future reflected in a stranger's restraint. He could not stop staring at the scars, at the stillness, at the way Daniel scanned the edges without seeming to move his eyes, and he leaned toward his partner to whisper that something about the man's posture looked like pictures from a training manual he was not supposed to have seen, the ones about how certain operatives carried their weight, the ones filed under history they didn't teach and operations they never admitted happened. His partner told him to shut up and hold the perimeter and stop looking for myths in a diner arrest. Yet the rookie could not shake the feeling that the land beneath them had tilted by a degree, subtle enough to doubt, but certain enough to feel in the ankles. As the cruiser eased into the street, a white sedan with tinted windows glided into the line of traffic and stayed 2 lengths back, with the polite persistence of a tail that knew how to pretend it wasn't a tail at all. Daniel watched the silhouette of the passenger as a sliver in the side mirror, read the angle of the head and the stillness of the hands, and under the roar of the siren, he said one sentence to the sergeant that made the older man's knuckles blanch against the steering wheel. He told him, in that even voice, to take the long route and avoid the river bridge because the bridge would be a trap if the person in the sedan had anything to do with the story already being written about him, and the sergeant barked that he was not about to take advice from a suspect, but his foot hesitated over the turn signal, as if the muscle had its own memory of getaways gone wrong. The rookie's radio crackled with a dispatch update that the bank footage was being enhanced and facial recognition had flagged an anomaly, a word that meant nothing and everything. And in the rear seat, Daniel closed his eyes for a count of 3 and let the past uncoil like a rope he had kept coiled tight. Then opened them again to the present where his breath fogged the glass and the sedan slipped suddenly out of sight as if it had never been there, leaving only the siren, the lights, and the sure knowledge that however this day had begun, it had been waiting for him for years. Inside the interrogation room, the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than any voice, a sound that seemed to burrow under the skin, constant and cold. Daniel sat at the metal table, wrists still cuffed, the smell of sweat and disinfectant thick in the air. Across from him, Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, arms folded, studying him as though he were a riddle written in invisible ink. Harris was not young. The deep lines at the corners of his eyes came from years of seeing men lie, men who swore they were innocent while the evidence sat like a weight between them. But this Daniel Cross, was different. He wasn't sweating, wasn't trembling, wasn't angry. He was composed in a way that made Harris uneasy, like a man who had already accepted a fate the detective didn't yet understand. "You know," Harris said, voice gravelly, "guys in your situation usually start talking fast, begging for a lawyer, swearing on their mother's grave. You haven't asked for either." Daniel lifted his eyes slowly, and in that movement was something deliberate, something measured, like a man scanning for weak points in a wall. "When a man's innocent," he said softly, "sometimes silence says more than pleading ever could." Harris smirked. "You call this silence? You've been found near the scene of a double homicide and armed robbery. No ID, cash only, no phone, no record anyone can access. That's not silence, that's secrecy." He dropped a folder on the table, photographs sliding out, grayscale images of a crime scene, the victim's hand reaching for air, the sharp geometry of spilled blood. "You want to tell me what this looks like to you?" Daniel didn't look away. "It looks like someone's idea of misdirection," he replied evenly. "You think I did this because you've been told a story that fits too easily. You just don't realize who's writing it." The detective frowned. The phrasing hit like static in his mind. "What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel exhaled, slow and steady, and for a second, Harris caught something in his eyes, grief maybe, or recognition, but it vanished before he could name it. Outside the mirrored glass, 2 other officers watched. One of them, the rookie from the diner, whispered, "Sir, the prints came back from the lab. They're classified." "Classified?" the captain echoed. "From which agency?" "They wouldn't say. Just that the database match is restricted, top-level clearance only. Someone from Washington's already called twice asking if we've got him in custody." The captain's face tightened. "This guy isn't just some drifter, then." "Keep that call quiet. Harris needs to push harder." Back in the room, Harris leaned forward, tapping a pen on the table. "Let's start simple. Your name, your last known address, where you were born?" "Daniel Cross," he said, "and that's all that matters. The detective slammed his hand against the table. Don't play games with me. You think you can just sit there and act like you're above this? Daniel's voice didn't rise. I think the more noise you make, the less truth you hear. Harris stared at him for a long moment, anger and curiosity wrestling inside his chest. He'd broken murderers with less effort than this. But this man, he had the poise of someone who'd faced worse than handcuffs. Minutes later, the door opened. The rookie slipped in, trying to hide his tension. Detective, he murmured, we just got a federal order. They want him released immediately. No explanation, Harris blinked. Released? On what grounds? They didn't say. Just no further questioning. Harris's jaw tightened. He'd been on the force long enough to know that when Washington said jump, most people asked how high. But something about this stank of fear, not authority. He waved the rookie out and turned back to Daniel. Why would they want you released? What are you mixed up in? Daniel met his eyes with quiet certainty. Maybe I'm mixed up in telling the truth to the wrong people. Harris leaned back slowly, studying him again, and the silence between them thickened until even the lights seemed to hold their breath. You're no ordinary suspect, he muttered. Who are you really? Daniel looked at the mirrored wall, knowing full well someone stood behind it. Ask them, he said. They already know. The detective's radio buzzed and the voice on the other end trembled as it spoke. Sir, a black SUV just pulled up outside. Government plates. They're here for the prisoner. Harris's gut tightened. He stepped to the glass, saw the vehicle waiting, engine idling, men in dark suits stepping out, faces blank and efficient. He turned back to Daniel, but something in the man's posture had changed. Not fear, readiness. You're not surprised, Harris said. Daniel's mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. They've been chasing ghosts for years. Sometimes the ghost decides to stop running. Meaning, it means the truth always costs something, Daniel said. And they're about to find the bill. Before Harris could reply, the door opened and two men in suits entered. One flashed credentials too quickly to read and said, Detective, the prisoner is now under federal custody. Transfer him immediately. Under whose authority? Harris challenged. Classified. But Daniel's voice cut through the air before the detective could argue further. You'll regret letting them take me, he said quietly, because when the truth breaks surface, it doesn't ask permission to breathe. The agents gripped Daniel's arms and let him out. As he passed Harris, he looked at him once more, eyes filled with something that felt like both warning and mercy. When the door closed, Harris stood frozen. His instincts screamed that he'd just handed over a man who wasn't guilty, but dangerous only to those who feared the light. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like an omen. The black SUV pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the rain, and Harris caught his own reflection in the wet glass, haunted, uncertain, yet alive with the strange certainty that this arrest was only the surface of something vast, something that would soon demand every truth he'd buried to rise again. The black SUV sliced through the rain like a dark blade, wipers slashing across the windshield in rhythmic fury. Inside, Daniel Cross sat motionless between two federal agents who spoke in clipped murmurs into their earpieces. His hands were still cuffed, but he sat with the posture of a man who was not bound. A man who had already calculated every possible route the vehicle could take, every blind corner, every turn where a choice might be made. The air inside smelled of leather and cold metal. The agent on his left, broad-shouldered with a jaw like carved stone, kept glancing at Daniel as though trying to see through him. You've been hard to find, the man said finally, his tone an odd mix of irritation and respect. Daniel's voice came calm, almost weary. You've been looking in the wrong places, the agent scoffed. Don't flatter yourself. People disappear every day. You just happen to vanish from the kind of life that doesn't let people walk away. The rain hammered the roof harder, thunder echoing in the distance. Daniel turned his gaze toward the window, watching the city lights streak and blur, and said softly, Walking away was never the hard part. Staying gone was. The agent looked at him sharply, but Daniel didn't elaborate. He knew that the less he said, the more they'd fill in the blanks themselves. That was how survival worked. Let your silence do the talking while others drown in their own assumptions. As the vehicle approached the edge of town, Daniel noticed the route they were taking. Not to the federal building, not to a courthouse, not even toward the city. They were heading north toward the woods, an area the government used for temporary transfers. He had once used those roads himself years ago when he was the one giving orders. "Where are we going?" he asked, though his voice carried no fear. The driver didn't answer. The agent beside him smirked. "You'll see soon enough." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and let the rhythm of the tires carry him back to another storm. Another night, another set of men in suits who thought they knew what control meant. Back then, he had been Major Daniel Cross, Counterintelligence Division, one of the best in a unit so secret that even its name changed every 6 months. His job had been to expose infiltration within the defense network, double agents, internal leaks, financial manipulations tied to powerful hands. And he had been good at it. Too good. He had found patterns that were never meant to be found. Offshore accounts linked to politicians who preached patriotism. Weapons contracts tied to ghost companies run by the same men who were supposed to oversee security. The moment he tried to report what he found, the trap closed. His clearance revoked. His reputation erased. His name flagged as unstable, dangerous, unreliable. He had gone from trusted guardian to hunted liability in a single memo stamped confidential. His wife Claire had been told he died in an overseas accident. His son Evan had been too young to understand why his father's medals were mailed home in a box with no body. Daniel had watched from afar for years, through borrowed identities, through shadows and static, watching his family rebuild while he became the ghost they were told to mourn. The SUV jolted suddenly as they turned off the main road, gravel crunching under the tires. Daniel opened his eyes. The woods closed in around them, tall pines bending under the wind. Then the vehicle slowed, headlights cutting across an old service gate secured with a chain. The driver stopped, stepped out, and began to unlock it. That's when Daniel spoke quietly, almost conversationally. "This isn't a transfer, is it?" The agent beside him stiffened. "What makes you say that?" "Because if it were," Daniel said, meeting his gaze evenly, "you'd have taken the eastern bypass to the airstrip. This road doesn't go anywhere but a decommissioned range, and men like you don't improvise." The agent hesitated, his jaw flexing. "You talk too much for a dead man." Daniel's reply was a whisper, deliberate and cold. "So that's the plan, then." The driver returned, rain dripping from his coat. The gate creaked open. As the SUV rolled forward, Daniel leaned slightly, studying the angle of the side mirror. A faint reflection, another pair of headlights far behind them, distant but following. For the first time that night, something flickered in his chest that felt like hope. Meanwhile, miles away in the precinct, Detective Harris sat alone in the observation room, re-watching the interrogation footage. There was something in Daniel's eyes, something that didn't fit the profile of a fugitive. He froze the frame, zoomed in on the reflection in the glass behind Daniel. It wasn't his own reflection staring back, it was another man's face. A face Harris recognized, his heart kicked hard. The man in that reflection had been at the station hours before the arrest, introducing himself as a federal liaison, giving orders about how to handle the suspect. Harris pulled the logbook, scanned the signature, and there it was, Director Mason Cole. A name he hadn't heard in 10 years. Not since the classified case that ended with 3 agents dead and one, Major Daniel Cross, declared missing. Harris felt his throat tighten. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he shouldn't still know. When the voice answered, he said only, "You were right. He's alive, and they're moving him somewhere off record." Static filled the line, then the voice said, "Then you better decide whose side you're on, detective. Because once the truth comes out, no one stays clean." Back in the SUV, the headlights behind them vanished again. Daniel turned his gaze back to the forest, knowing full well what awaited him. A bullet, a cover-up, another lie in the archives of invisible wars. But beneath his calm, something else stirred, a purpose long buried, now breathing again. He wasn't done yet. Not until every name written in those secret files saw the light. Not until his son knew who his father really was. The SUV stopped. The agent opened the door and motioned him out. Cold rain hit his face, sharp and alive. Daniel looked up at the dark outline of an abandoned facility, its walls scarred with old bullet holes and secrets that refused to die. He smiled faintly, a ghost of defiance crossing his face. "You brought me back to the right place," he murmured, "where it all began." And as lightning split the sky, The past he'd buried began clawing its way to the surface. The rain was relentless, a living curtain that blurred the night into streaks of silver and shadow. The two agents shoved Daniel toward the crumbling doorway of the abandoned range building, their flashlights cutting through the mist like surgical blades. The place smelled of rust, damp cement, and forgotten sins. The echoes of their boots bounced off walls tattooed with bullet holes from wars no one remembered. "Inside," the taller agent ordered. Daniel obeyed, not because he was beaten, but because he wanted to see who would be waiting for him. He'd walked into ambushes before. He just needed to know whose fingerprints were on this one. As he stepped into the large, hollow room, the faint hum of a generator filled the silence. A single hanging bulb buzzed to life, swaying slightly from its cord, and under its pale light stood a man Daniel hadn't seen in almost 12 years. "Hello?" "Major?" said Mason Cole, his voice smooth as ever. Untouched by guilt or age, Daniel froze. For a moment the years collapsed. The betrayal, the mission gone wrong, the gunfire in that warehouse overseas, the explosion that was supposed to erase him. Mason had been his superior officer, his mentor, his friend, and the man who'd ordered his death. "Mason," Daniel said slowly, his voice a mix of disbelief and cold recognition. "You should have stayed buried." Mason smiled, the kind of smile that hid knives. "And yet here we are, both of us refusing to die." "You were always too stubborn for your own good." The agents shifted uneasily. One of them whispered, "Sir, we were told he was to be—" Mason cut him off. "I'll handle this personally." He stepped closer, eyes glinting under the flickering bulb. "You know, Daniel, the only mistake you made was believing that truth mattered more than control. You should have known better. The world doesn't want heroes, it wants order. And you broke it." Daniel studied him, his jaw tight. "You framed me to save your own career. You killed innocent men and blamed me because you needed a ghost. So here I am." Mason's smirk faltered just enough to show the crack in his armor. "You're not supposed to be alive. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble your little resurrection has caused? There are people in Washington who'd rather burn an entire building than admit you exist." Daniel's voice dropped low. "Dangerous. Then maybe it's time the fire spreads." The shorter agent raised his weapon nervously. "Sir, he's dangerous." "Put it down," Mason snapped. But his eyes never left Daniel. "You still don't get it, do you? You think coming back means you can fix what we broke. But you've been gone too long. The files are sealed. The people who mattered have moved on. Even your family. Claire remarried. Your son's a grown man. You're a ghost in a world that stopped waiting for you." Daniel didn't flinch, but the words hit like shrapnel. His silence was heavy, the kind that carried both grief and resolve. "My family was told I was dead," he said quietly, "and you made sure they believed it. But the truth has a way of bleeding through, Mason. It always does." A distant sound interrupted them, tires crunching on gravel. Headlights flashed briefly through the rain. Mason turned sharply. "What the hell, who else is here?" Before the agents could react, gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets punched through the walls, sparks bursting like fireflies. The agents ducked, returning fire. Mason shouted for backup, but the radios crackled with static. Daniel dove behind a fallen beam, the cuffs still biting his wrists. The bulb swung wildly above, casting chaotic shadows across the room. Then a familiar voice cut through the chaos. A voice Daniel never thought he'd hear again. "Get down, Dad!" Daniel's heart stopped. Through the rain and gunfire, a figure burst into view. His son Evan. Older now, leaner, eyes sharp with the same quiet focus Daniel once carried. Harris was right behind him, gun drawn, shouting orders. For a moment, everything slowed. Mason's eyes widened as realization hit. "You brought them here? You fool, you just killed them." Daniel lunged for the nearest agent, using the man's surprise to his advantage. In one motion, he twisted his body, snapped the man's arm, and caught the falling pistol. Harris fired from the doorway, dropping the second agent before he could aim. "Evan, stay low," Daniel shouted, moving toward the center of the room. Mason ducked behind a pillar, firing wildly. The old building echoed with thunder and gunfire, the storm outside roaring like an angry god. Evan crawled to his father's side, panting. "They said you were dead." Daniel's eyes met his. "So did I." They shared no time for reunion, only survival. Mason shouted something unintelligible, a curse swallowed by the storm, then bolted toward a back exit. Daniel pushed Evan behind a crate and chased after him. "Mason," he yelled. "You're not running this time." The two men collided near the stairwell. Mason swung first, catching Daniel's jaw, but Daniel countered, driving his elbow into Mason's ribs. They struggled, old soldiers with old grudges, until Mason grabbed Daniel's gun and aimed. "You think truth wins?" Mason hissed. "It never does." But before he could pull the trigger, Harris appeared at the top of the stairs. "Drop it, Cole." Mason hesitated just long enough. Daniel twisted his wrist, the gun fired one shot, echoing through the entire building. Mason staggered back, eyes wide, and fell down the steps, landing hard on the cold concrete. For a second, there was only silence. Then Harris lowered his weapon and exhaled. "He's gone." Daniel stood there, chest heaving, rain dripping from his hair, staring down at the man who had once destroyed his life. He didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. He looked at Harris, then at his son. "It's not over, not yet. There's more to this." Mason wasn't the top. Evan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Daniel turned toward the open doorway where the SUV's lights still flickered. "Someone else was pulling the strings. And if we don't find them before they find us..." He trailed off, eyes narrowing at something beyond the tree line. Movement, silhouettes too still to be trees. Harris followed his gaze. "We've got company." Daniel took a deep breath, his voice low but steady. Then it begins again. And as lightning tore the sky open, the shadows advanced, silent and deliberate, while the truth, finally awake, was just beginning to show its teeth. Rain hissed through the cracked roof like steam from a wounded machine as Daniel, Harris and Evan crouched behind the rusted pillars of the old range building. The night outside pulsed with shadows and the cold hum of engines idling just beyond the tree line. Every instinct Daniel had ever buried screamed at him. The pattern of movement, the silence between thunderclaps, the telltale rhythm of boots against mud. These weren't police. They weren't even federal. These were clean-up men, the kind sent when evidence needed to vanish. Harris reloaded, his hands shaking slightly. "There's at least 6 out there," he muttered. "They're fanning out. Thermal scopes, tactical formation. Someone sent a private team." Daniel glanced toward the open doorway. "They're not here for me," he said. "They're here for what Mason was protecting." Evan frowned, whispering urgently. "What do you mean?" "You said Mason was behind everything." Daniel's voice was calm, but beneath it was a thread of fire. He was a handler, not the architect. The real power never leaves fingerprints, but Mason kept insurance, proof, files. He was paranoid enough to keep them close. He nodded toward a metal cabinet against the far wall, half covered by debris. "That's what they want," Harris cursed under his breath. "If those files name who I think they do, we'll never get out alive." "Then we don't run," Daniel said quietly. "We make sure the truth does." Outside, lightning illuminated the field for a split second, revealing dark figures moving through the rain. Silent, precise, professional. The sound of a suppressed gunshot cracked through the air, a warning. A bullet ricocheted off the wall inches above Evan's head. Harris ducked, shouting, "We're pinned!" Daniel scanned the room. His eyes fell on an old fuse box near the generator. A plan began to form, risky, desperate, but alive. "Evan, stay with Harris. When I tell you to move, you run for that back door and don't stop." Evan shook his head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." Daniel gripped his shoulder hard, eyes steady. "You've already lost one father once. Don't make me bury you to protect me again." The words hit like a blow, raw and final. Evan's jaw trembled, but he nodded, tears mixing with the rain that streaked his face. Daniel rose and moved toward the fuse box, unfastening the metal cover with a rusted tool. The hum of the generator pulsed under his hands. He twisted 2 wires together and sparks burst like angry stars. The lights flickered, died, then returned dimmer, just enough to cast moving shadows across the walls. It was enough to confuse the men outside, to blur the silhouettes. "Now," Daniel whispered into the radio clipped to Harris's belt. "When they breach, aim for the sound, not the shape." Seconds later, the door exploded inward, splinters flying. The first man through fell instantly. Harris's bullet hit his vest, sending him backward. The others fanned out, their suppressed rifles coughing fire into the gloom. Daniel moved like a ghost, his cuffs long since picked open with a broken nail. He ducked under a beam, grabbed the fallen agent's weapon, and returned fire with calm, lethal precision. Evan crouched low, hands over his ears, the roar of chaos swallowing his breath. Harris shouted something, he couldn't hear what. Smoke from the gunfire mixed with dust, turning the air thick and metallic. Through the haze, Daniel saw one of the intruders reach the cabinet and yank it open, grabbing a black drive taped to the inside wall. No. Daniel surged forward, catching the man before he could raise his gun. They crashed against the cabinet, the drive skittering across the floor. Daniel slammed his fist into the man's throat, disarming him, but another attacker appeared in the doorway, aiming straight at Daniel's chest. The shot came, but not from him. Evan stood there, gun trembling in his hands, eyes wide and wet. The man collapsed at Daniel's feet. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Father and son locked eyes, one shocked, the other burning with pride and sorrow. "You did what you had to," Daniel said softly. "Now let's finish this." Harris retrieved the drive, slipping it into his pocket. "This thing better be worth dying for." "It's not about dying," Daniel said. "It's about ending it." They pushed toward the exit, but more headlights appeared through the trees, dozens of them. Black SUVs, engines humming in unison. The reinforcements had arrived. Evan's voice cracked. "We can't fight that many." Daniel turned to him, calm amidst the storm. "We don't have to. We just need to let the truth out before they can bury it." He pulled a small satellite beacon from the fallen agent's gear, attached the drive, and set it to transmit. The signal blinked red, searching, connecting. For a moment, hope flickered like a heartbeat. Then a sniper's shot shattered the beacon. Sparks erupted and the light went out. Harris swore, throwing himself behind cover. "They're cutting off every exit." Daniel's eyes darted to the far end of the compound, a drainage tunnel half submerged in rainwater. "That's our way out. It leads to the creek past the ridge." Gunfire erupted again as they ran. Harris covered them, firing until his clip ran dry. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold them." Daniel grabbed his arm. "You're coming with us." Harris smiled grimly. "You'll need someone to testify. I'll see you on the other side." Before Daniel could argue, Harris turned and fired into the dark, drawing the attacker's focus. Daniel and Evan dove into the tunnel, the roar of the storm echoing behind them. They crawled through the narrow passage, water soaking them, bullets striking sparks off the concrete around them. When they finally emerged by the creek, Daniel looked back through the tunnel one last time, saw flashes of gunfire, heard Harris's last defiant shout, and then silence. Evan collapsed onto the wet ground, shaking. "He saved us," Daniel's face hardened. "Then we make it count." He held up the damaged drive, sparks flickering from the cracked shell. "There's still data left. Somewhere in here, Mason's secrets survive." He looked toward the horizon where dawn's first gray light began to bleed into the storm. "We'll finish this no matter what it costs." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew louder. Police, real this time. But Daniel knew who would reach them first. The game was no longer about survival. It was about revelation. And as thunder rolled over the dying storm, the world finally began to tilt toward truth, whether it was ready or not. The storm had broken by dawn, leaving behind a washed-out quiet that felt too calm for what had happened in the night. Mist curled across the creek as Daniel and Evan moved through the wet grass toward the road. The world smelled of earth and smoke, of endings and beginnings. Daniel's arm bled from a shallow wound, but he barely noticed. He carried the cracked drive in one hand like a relic, the weight of it heavier than any weapon he'd ever held. Evan walked beside him, pale but steady, his hair plastered to his forehead. Neither spoke for a while. Every sound, the drip of water from branches, the distant hum of traffic, seemed unreal, as if the world hadn't quite decided to let them return to it. Finally, Evan broke the silence, his voice small. "He really died back there, didn't he?" "Detective Harris?" Daniel nodded. "He made sure we could get out. That's who he was." His voice faltered for a second, but then he added, "He believed truth still mattered. That's rare these days." They reached a narrow country road. A gas station sign flickered half a mile ahead. Daniel's instinct told him they wouldn't have long before the men Mason served came looking. He glanced at the drive, then at his son. "We can't keep running. We need to finish what I started years ago." Evan frowned. "You mean expose them?" Daniel stopped walking. "Not just them, everything, the entire network." He crouched beside the road, pried open the drive's casing with a pocket knife, and studied the tiny circuit boards inside. Most were fried, but one corner still pulsed faintly, blinking. "It's still alive," he murmured. "Part of the data's intact." They reached the gas station just as the first streaks of sunlight cut through the clouds. Daniel asked the sleepy clerk for a payphone, offering cash for privacy. The man pointed toward the back hallway. Daniel stepped inside, dialed a number burned into his memory, a number belonging to someone who owed him a debt from the old days. When the line clicked, a woman's voice answered cautiously. "Who is this?" "Tell them the ghost of Operation Halcyon is still walking," Daniel said. A pause, then the woman whispered, "Major Cross? My God, we thought you were—" "I was," he said. "Listen to me carefully. I have evidence tying Cole's unit to half the covert funding streams they denied existed. Offshore accounts, shell companies, even congressional links. But they're hunting us. I need this data uploaded anonymously. Can you still move information without a trace?" She hesitated. "You're asking for a miracle." Daniel's voice softened. "No, I'm asking for a chance to let truth breathe before they smother it again." There was another pause, then, "Send it." He handed Evan the phone. "Read her the serial number on this chip. She'll do the rest." Evan obeyed, his hands trembling but his voice clear. When he hung up, he asked, "So that's it? You trust them?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Trust? No. But I trust what happens when people see the truth with their own eyes. Once it's out, it can't be unseen." Minutes later, as they sat outside beneath the gas station awning, a low rumble echoed from the highway. An approaching convoy. Daniel tensed, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his coat. But when the first vehicles appeared, they weren't black SUVs. They were local police cruisers. Behind them came unmarked news vans. Within the hour, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed as encrypted files began flooding news feeds worldwide. Documents detailing money trails, assassinations covered as accidents, political bribes, and intelligence. Manipulations buried for years. Mason Cole's death was confirmed. So were the names of his superiors. The headlines called it the Cross Revelation. Daniel watched from the diner across the street, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. Evan sat opposite, scrolling through the headlines with wide eyes. "They're calling you a whistleblower hero," he said. "They want interviews, statements, everything." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, they don't need me. They need what I uncovered. Heroes fade. Truth doesn't." Evan's voice softened. "What happens to us now?" Daniel looked out the window, where sunlight glimmered on wet pavement. "You rebuild. Live a life not built on secrets. That's the justice your mother would have wanted." At the mention of Claire, a silence fell between them. Gentle, aching, necessary. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. Claire holding a baby boy, the corners creased from years of hiding. He laid it on the table. "You remind me of her every time you refuse to give up," he said. Evan swallowed hard. "You're not going back into hiding, are you?" Daniel's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "No, I've had enough of shadows." The bell above the diner door rang as a postal courier entered carrying a small box. "Delivery for a Mr. D. Cross," he said. Daniel frowned, signed for it, and opened the box. Inside was a single envelope stamped Department of Defense. He unfolded the paper inside and froze. It wasn't a warrant or a threat. It was a commendation. Posthumous Medal of Honor, Major Daniel Cross, dated 12 years earlier, signed by Mason Cole himself. Evan leaned forward, confused. "Why would he?" Daniel stared at the signature, his lips curving into something between disbelief and sorrow. "Insurance," he whispered. "Even traitors need their ghosts decorated." He folded the paper, placed it back in the envelope, and said quietly, "Then let's make sure this one finally rests." He stood, walked outside, and laid the envelope in a metal trash bin beside the diner. He struck a match, the flame trembling in the morning breeze, and dropped it in. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash. Evan joined him, watching it burn. "You could have kept it." Daniel's eyes never left the smoke as it rose into the pale sky. "No," he said softly. "Some honors are just disguises for guilt. I'd rather live free than die remembered for a lie." The two stood there in silence, the warmth of the fire fading as the first full light of morning broke through the clouds. In that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years, not victory, not revenge, but release. The ghosts of his past no longer hunted him. They were finally still. He turned to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The hardest battles," he said, "aren't fought with guns, they're fought with truth. And truth doesn't kill, it cleanses." As they walked down the road together, the world behind them buzzed with headlines, speculation, and awe. But Daniel didn't look back. He had nothing left to hide from. The man once arrested without cause had become the proof that even the most buried truth could rise again, and that redemption, though late, was still possible. And somewhere deep in Washington, an anonymous fund appeared online for victims of wrongful imprisonment, signed only by 2 letters, DC. The ghost had finally come home.